Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Welcome back to the Daily Dose of Doom and Gloom. You know, nothing in the realm of geopolitics is as it seems. Nothing. Case in point, this picture behind me here. What is wrong with this picture? Something very counterintuitive with this picture, isn't there? Considering that 6 months later, these guys went to war. Why is it that when I was first exposed to this picture in the year 2021, I was filled with a sense of optimism that perhaps these long-standing adversaries were finally coming together to resolve their differences, that perhaps this was an auspicious moment in terms of Russian and US relations, perhaps signaling a move to a unipolar world where it was going to be peace and prosperity for all. Unfortunately, World War III started 6 years later. This is a warning for people that this sort of demonstrative diplomacy is what precedes great wars. This handshake right here, it's akin to the touching of the gloves before the boxing match starts. And we've seen the same thing happen in the last 24 hours with Anthony Blinken and Xi Jinping. We may even see Joe Biden go to China, and that will officially commemorate the start of the war between China and the United States. Because both of these sides are unrelenting. In spite of whatever rhetoric the United States or China utters, we know that their interests are opposed, fundamentally opposed. And that means we are on an inexorable march towards war with the Chinese and quite possibly nuclear war with the Russians. And I'm going to tell you why. Now, before we talk about exactly what's going on with that situation, let's just break down everything that's going on today. We have the fear, uncertainty, and doubt meter, the photometer, at 87 today. And here are the reasons why. I'm going to share with you two essays, one written by a Western scholar and the other by a Russian scholar, that talk about why the use of nuclear weapons in the conflict is inevitable, and they try to argue that the sooner we use nukes, the less likely it will escalate to the strategic or level of mutually assured destruction. He makes a very compelling argument for why Russia should use tactical nukes sooner than later, and that the longer they wait, the risk of full-blown war between NATO and Russia escalates. We're also going to talk about why the Alaska undersea cables that were cut by an iceberg may foretell what the outcome is going to be in a hybrid war between East and West. We're going to talk about how the China and US talks actually failed and why there was no military agreements that came from that. We're going to talk about the market greed index at elevated levels. Does this signal that a market crash is imminent? People are very, very greedy again. And of course, the Shiller PE ratio, I should say, is sky high right now at 30.78, higher than it was at before the crash of the Great Depression in 1929. We have China potentially dumping U.S. treasuries if there is a war between the United States and China. Now, a congressperson posed this question to Janet Yellen the other day and asked her, what if China dumps all its U.S. dollars? They're one of the primary holders of U.S. treasuries. If they dump their dollars, the value of the dollar depreciates drastically, and it leads to hyperinflation, essentially, because if China dumps, a lot of other people are going to dump as well. And does the USA have a plan of action for this? It turns out, surprise, surprise, they do not. Europe is preparing for a war economy. Jens Stoltenberg has said that they're running out of ammunition, and thus they got to boost their military industry. So Europe is on track for a military industrialization, the likes of which we haven't seen since World War II. There are widespread fears of cyber attack and military in the streets. These are just rumors at this point in time. You see, once a year, it seems as though somebody starts a rumor that there's a higher level of military activity than normal. And in some cases, this is true due to more exercises. And I can understand why people are concerned when you're seeing, videos of 20 Osprey helicopters flying overhead, or train loads of various military equipment and military in the streets. And we have this confirmation bias. And right now it's totally justified because fear, uncertainty, and doubt is very high. World War III could break out any minute. But all I would say is just take it all with a grain of salt and understand that some of these videos were videos that were taken a long time ago. Some, in fact, may have been taken in the last few days. But again, military activity is always ongoing. So you just have to be skeptical when watching these things. But indeed, I would not be surprised if our military was on a much higher state of readiness. And if they weren't, then they're incredibly incompetent, and they are incredibly incompetent. So, there's a chance that they aren't, unfortunately. We have 4 days left of the largest NATO exercise in history. Some people think that this may be a launching point for a real world event in the form of NATO intervening in Ukraine. We're going to talk about all the reasons why it's seeming ever more likely that this war is going to ultimately and inexorably amount to NATO getting into a direct clash with Russia in Ukraine. We're going to talk about Ukraine possibly getting nukes, according to former retired General Ben Hodges of the U.S. military. Ukraine may in fact seek to get nuclear weapons. Well, we know what's going to happen if that happens. Likely, we're going to see the use of tactical nuclear weapons used first. And I'm going to read you this very compelling argument as to the reasons why in just a minute. There is new suspicion of, I should say this is from Russian intelligence, so take it with a grain of salt. Suspicions that Ukraine is working on a nuclear dirty bomb. Now, there was suspicions of this last year in November, I do believe. Now they're saying that they have evidence to suggest that there's been some fissionable material, so spent nuclear fuel, which has been removed from a Ukrainian nuclear facility without the oversight of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So there's some missing nuclear material, and the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians are planning to use this in a nuclear dirty bomb. Again, take it with a grain of salt. Zaluzhny mythos continues, okay? There's more and more clues that something is seriously wrong with the Ukrainian commander, the top guy in the Ukrainian military. There was another video that was released today that led to more questions than it provided answers, you could say. And we're going to show you that video and talk a little bit about some of the Easter eggs in there that signal that, yeah, this was definitely, it's not as it seems. Putin, when at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum recently, in front of an audience of dignitaries from a variety of different countries who are currently, I guess, more or less in some way in support of Russia or allied with Russia, I guess you could say, showed a video which was very Orwellian. And it was about Ukraine's involvement with the Nazis in the past and the Banderites and a lot of the atrocities that were committed. And the audience reaction was incredibly Orwellian. I can only show you a little bit of the video because it's very sensitive content, but we'll talk a little bit about what that means just so you can get an understanding of what the Russian psyche is around this war and why they're so committed and unrelenting. We're going to talk about some other things with respect to mock S-300s and S-400s seen in the United States in this flurry of social media posts about heightened military readiness around the United States. One of the videos showed a mock S-300 and S-400, like a decoy system in the United States on a train, and we're going to talk about what the implications of that might be. We also need to talk about Russian general making the claim that the U.S. was testing in Ukraine the utilization of insects as biological attack vectors. I know, sounds crazy, but honestly, anything is possible this day and age. Now, I want to read you a bit of an article about why nuclear war is inevitable. Now, this is by Sergei Karaganov, who is an honorary chairman of the Presidium Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. And this is just a very short excerpt of the article. I would encourage you to go and read the entire article because they provide a very, very compelling case for why Russia should use nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not advocating that. This is what he's saying. And because the argument seems to check out, it's very likely that someone high up in the Russian top brass who has the authority to make the decision might actually go this route. Here's what he says. We can keep fighting for another year or 2 or 3, sacrificing thousands and thousands of our best men and grinding down tens of thousands of people who live in the territory that is now called Ukraine, who have fallen into the tragic historical trap. But this military operation cannot end with a decisive victory without forcing the West to defeat or retreat strategically or even surrender, which is something they're unlikely to do. And I'm paraphrasing here just so I can get through this. Therefore, it is necessary to arouse the instinct of self-preservation that the West has lost and convince it that attempts to wear Russia out by arming Ukrainians are counterproductive. For the West itself, we will have to make nuclear deterrence a convincing argument once again. And you do this by lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, which is currently set at an unacceptably high level, and by rapidly but prudently moving up the deterrence escalation ladder. Excuse me. The first steps have already been made in the deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus, but there are many steps on this ladder, and he says there's around a dozen steps up this ladder that are remaining. Things must also get to the point where we will have to urge our compatriots and all the people of goodwill to leave their places of residence near facilities that may become targets for strikes in countries that provide direct support to the puppet regime in Kiev. So he's saying that before Russia would strike any of these regions, they would notify Russians living in those countries, if it's surrounding a NATO base, that you need to remove yourself from the situation as soon as possible, because we very well could strike. He's saying that that's one of the necessary steps up the escalatory ladder. The enemy must know that we are ready to deliver a preemptive strike in retaliation for all its current and past acts of aggression in order to prevent a slide into global thermonuclear war. So what he's saying is that the longer NATO gets involved and the more weapons that NATO sends, and the greater the sophistication of the weapons, and the more entwined NATO becomes in this conflict, in their mission creep into Ukraine, the greater the likelihood that a nuclear incident immediately escalates to the level of Russia fighting NATO. He's essentially saying that you need to use a nuke before NATO enters Ukraine. Because as soon as NATO enters Ukraine, there's a very strong likelihood that this could go right to the level of Russia and NATO getting in an all-out shooting match with their strategic warheads. I have said and written many times that if we correctly build a strategy of intimidation and deterrence, and even use nuclear weapons, the risk of retaliatory nuclear or any other strike on our territory can be reduced to an absolute minimum. We must not repeat the Ukrainian scenario for a quarter of a century. I've always said that eventually Russians are probably going to call our bluff, and they're going to realize, excuse me, that we likely won't respond because we don't want nuclear annihilation in the same way that they don't. We keep crossing their red lines, but sooner or later, they're going to be forced to cross one of our red lines. And when we don't respond with a nuclear response, maybe that's going to be license for them to continue along that escalatory path and possibly even signal that, hey, we can use a nuclear weapon and the response is not going to lead to the end of the world. That perhaps we can normalize the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. The one sticking point here would be the Chinese. He claims that the Chinese benefit from a protracted war with Russia and the West due to the fact that it allows China to build up its forces in anticipation for a war with China. If Russia delivered a nuclear strike, he says, the Chinese would condemn it, but they would also rejoice at heart that a powerful blow has been dealt to the reputation and position of the United States. And perhaps that would also be a warning to the United States that the Chinese would have a willingness to utilize nuclear weapons in a similar fashion. So what he's saying is that this war is going to go on for a long, long time. And the longer the war goes on, the greater the likelihood that if nuclear weapons are used, it is going to immediately go, or it's going to be faster to go to the level of strategic nuclear warheads, in which there are missiles firing from Washington to Moscow. Something to consider. I found that to be a very good article, and again, that was only about 5% of the article. Now, there's another article written by a Western scholar who talks about the same thing, but from the perspective of the United States, and how the United States has actually been preparing for this possibility of using nuclear weapons as well. Since the initiation of the United States' multi-trillion-dollar nuclear weapons buildup in 2016, the U.S. has been working to create smaller and lower-yield, usable nuclear weapons. In fact, this was a policy dating back for quite some time. Henry Kissinger was one of the first people to introduce this idea that you can escalate to de-escalate, that utilizing small tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, like the Davy Crockett. We've done a whole video on the different types of tactical nuclear warheads. You can go and check that out. That you could utilize those on the battlefield, and that they could, in fact, minimize the risk of escalation to the strategic level. So you're seeing both sides position themselves for a limited nuclear war. In 2019, Foreign Affairs published an article entitled, "If You Want Peace, Prepare for a Nuclear War" by Elbridge Colby, one of the principal authors of Trump's 2018 National Defense Strategy. And in 2022, the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review made it clear that U.S. reserves the right to use nuclear weapons to achieve any kind of national objective, meaning that they'll do a first strike if they feel the need to. So it's important to understand that both sides are considering it to be strategic to use nukes sooner than later in order to bring this conflict to some sort of detente. Now, Alaska, undersea cables were cut. We're going to jump around the map a little bit here. There was a long internet outage in northwestern Alaska. It's been about a week since ice severed a fiber optic cable in the Arctic Ocean. This is a submarine cable map, and you can see the one line that they're referring to is right here. Most, I think 90% of online communication happens via these undersea cables, especially, of course, between nation states. Now, nowadays you have other options like Starlink, but this is a real-world example of what would happen in an all-out hybrid war between NATO and Russia has, in fact, recently threatened, particularly around the UK, to sever some of their communications. Being an island, UK is totally dependent on these undersea cables for its communication, and there were talks about utilizing a nuclear weapon for this purpose of destroying some of these undersea cables. So this is something we would see as preemptive to perhaps an actual kinetic war. We're also seeing increased concern about cyber attacks. Now, there's a lot of canards around the internet right now about the prospect. One guy has a viral video where he's saying that he's got word that the US military is preparing for a widespread attack on the critical infrastructure, and you could probably make reference to the fact of the senators which were given the satellite phones just a few months ago. And in light of everything else that's going on right now, including the recent major cyber attack on the US government, not counting the SolarWinds attack, which still has implications to this day, it can be easy to understand how there might be some truth to this. I'm not losing sleep over it, but yeah, I mean, is there a possibility that a widespread cyber attack could indeed cripple critical infrastructure across the United States? It would have to be a very large coordinated attack. It would definitely be coming from the nation state level. And I think an attack of that scope and scale would be a declaration of war if it were to happen. Now, a limited attack or some ransom attack or denial of service attack in isolated pockets around the United States, that's likely not going to lead to a war between Russia and NATO, but something that people are concerned about would definitely lead. This would be what preceded a war with NATO. First, it would be a cyber attack. Then first it would be hybrid style attacks, and I suppose you could classify cyber as that. So hybrid would be activity targeting offshore infrastructure, onshore infrastructure, sabotage acts behind enemy lines, and that's a method of hybrid warfare. Then you might have cyber attack, electromagnetic pulse, and all-out nuclear war, satellite warfare. Those things would all sort of happen in that sequence. It could happen. I mean, it very well could happen. You have the largest NATO air defense exercise happening right now as we speak. And some people think that is a front for a real deal deployment of NATO into Ukraine. Again, I'm not going to speak definitively either way, because I would say always be prepared, and that's why we prepare on this channel. That's why we've been warning people to prepare for a long time, because if there ever was a time that something like this could pop off, sure, it would be now. We are at the highest risk and a higher risk than we were at yesterday. And the same will be true tomorrow. That trend is going to continue. The risk elevation is only going to continue. Okay? Now, China and USA talks have essentially failed. China has refused to resume military-to-military contacts, and this is one of the biggest things. In fact, North Korea and the United States have had this issue for many, many months. The deconfliction lines simply don't exist. So in spite of the fact that Anthony Blinken met Xi Jinping and his counterpart in China, I can't remember what his name is, unfortunately there is no back channel for de-escalation with Chinese and the United States. And we know that recently there was a leaked document that suggested that that the United States had a contingency plan in the works to evacuate their citizens from Taiwan, very similar to what happened in Ukraine and Afghanistan, just planning for the worst case scenario. There's nothing that signals de-escalation right now in Taiwan. And it only appears as though, in spite of whatever sort of rhetoric and sophistry Blinken used today in his statements that they don't respect Taiwan independence, you cannot believe anything that the US government or any of these governments says at this point. This is demonstrative diplomacy. This is obligatory. This is what you would do in a last-ditch effort to seem as though you are making an attempt to resolve the issue peacefully before you went to war. And oddly enough, you're also seeing all these other guys going to China. You've seen Elon Musk go to China recently. You've seen Bill Gates go and meet with Xi Jinping. You've seen Jamie Dimon, who insists that don't worry, there will be no decoupling and the world will go on. Well, it's either that or it's another instance of touching gloves before the opening bell. Because all of these guys do a lot of business in China, and they got to know how it's going to work if the US and China do go to war. So I think this is what you would see before something kinetic was to pop off. You would see this aggressive diplomacy. You would see these multinational companies wanting to go and seeing what exactly the plan is. Are the Chinese going to commandeer Elon Musk's gigafactories in Shanghai? Does the same apply to Bill Gates? What is the outcome going to be? They're going there because they want to know, hey, if we go to war, are you going to confiscate all our stuff? What is the situation going to look like? And so that's what I get from this. Maybe I'm being overly pessimistic about it. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comment section below. What other stories can we talk about today? There's a lot going on. Let's talk about this Zelensky character. Okay, so I've been talking about this for weeks. Many channels have been talking about it for weeks. Now, they released a video today that was very suspicious. Okay, Zelensky, for the first time, and he's missed so many important meetings that he's attended up until this point on a monthly basis with NATO. He's been present at meetings. I think what's going on is that something has happened to him. He has acquired brain injury, maybe some sort of cognitive deficiency as a result of, it could be war-related, it could be because he was caught up in a missile strike, or it could just be some other thing health-related. Guy could have had a stroke. You're under a lot of stress. So it could be a variety of things, but all of these anecdotes point towards something is wrong with him, and they're trying to minimize the amount that he talks on camera. That's the vibe I'm getting. And now, in all of these videos, he's only saying what he's instructed to say. Like, he's saying a few short lines, and I think he says in the videos the date. So there's a good chance that he's alive. I would say that, it's like 99% likely that he's alive, but I think he's compromised in some way. In this video that was released today, let's see if we can find it here. That's so many videos up. I guess I don't have that one video available, it looks like. Sorry, guys. But anyways, it's a video, and in the video, all the guys in the background, they're all blurred out. And coincidentally, they made sure to put the date on a piece of paper on the wall so people would know that it was the current date that he is alive. Because, of course, these rumors started swirling last month. It just seems that they were really trying to show that, okay, he is alive. And I understand why you would want to show and prove, so people couldn't say, oh, this is from such and such a date prior. But you can see in the video, he just doesn't look like he's in charge of the situation. He looks like he's being briefed on what's going on, which is not what you would think a commander would. I guess I shouldn't say that. In certain cases, you're going to be briefed. But he just doesn't seem right. And I'm sure many of you who go and you watch the video, you'll know what I'm talking about. He looks as though he's not 100%, and he's just kind of there acting to make it look like, to inspire, boost morale of the Ukrainian military, who probably is faltering a little bit as a result of not knowing where some of their leaders are, like Budanov, the head of the intelligence agency, and not seeing Zelensky very much lately, and seeing that this counteroffensive, at least as far as we're told, is not going so well, that they're suffering very heavy losses, and they're making few gains. However, according to Zelensky, if you listen to him, and I try to listen to both sides, because both sides have been wrong. There's many people who are jumping into the Russian camp right now, and they're taking everything at face value that the Russian Ministry of Defense says, and I would advise against doing that, because we've been surprised many times throughout this conflict. Zelensky claims no Patriot missile defense systems have been destroyed. He claims that there's 5 now. I didn't think there was 5, but he claims that all 5 have not been destroyed. I'm not sure if he was talking about the actual launchers or if he was talking about 5 systems as a whole. If there's that many there, then that's a lot more than we were initially supposed to send, as far as I know. Putin says the opposite. Putin says that, in fact, we have destroyed Patriot missile defense systems. But if we haven't, and if you believe Zelensky in that no HIMARS have been destroyed, if you believe Zelensky in that no Patriots have been destroyed, even if there's some truth to that, in that few have been destroyed, then that shows that, the Ukrainians are still in this fight. So I would not rule it out. And I know there's a lot of channels that get fed a lot of information from Telegram. One thing to just keep in mind is that we really are not going to know. And that's why I don't speculate too much about what's going on the battlefront. I mean, it's a good way to get an understanding of where both armies are at any given time. Because, of course, if Ukraine is not knocking on the door of Melitopol, then it's safe to say that the counteroffensive is not yet reaching any sort of critical mass. But according to them, the brunt of the counteroffensive has yet to even start. That these are all probing operations. Now, again, these guys have lied through their teeth throughout the whole conflict. Both sides have. So, am I leaning towards the counteroffensive isn't going well? Yes. And that's a good thing when it comes to this thing not going nuclear. Now, if it is going well, and if the Russians are being beat back towards the border, then that means that there is a risk that Russia could consider the tactical nuclear option. Now, this is a shot of the Novokakhovka Dam, or a place near that part of the river where it looks as though the water level is very, very low, and you could pretty much walk across at this point in time. Now, in this situation, the Ukrainians have an advantage because the water level is low. They now are in total control of the water level upstream, where that water gets rerouted, and they could easily make a crossing now without the need for as many amphibious vehicles, even though I'm quite certain this is going to be pretty muddy. But, if you have a lot of dry days, that could dry relatively quickly and the ground could be solid enough that you could stage some sort of offensive. And now that all of the Russians' defenses have been washed away, well, not all of them, but some of them, then it could potentially be even easier for them to pull off. So I guess we'll have to see. This is from the Russian media agency TASS. So this is Russian state-sponsored media now. Kiev may be still building a dirty bomb, according to the Russian intelligence service. The intelligence service has obtained data about Ukraine's decision to reprocess some spent nuclear fuel from one of their nuclear plants. And they claim that they did this without knowledge of the International Atomic Energy Agency, that they did this under the radar. So I guess we'll have to see. Is the plan, recall that not too long ago, just a few months ago, the United States installed some sensors throughout Ukraine to detect the use of a nuclear weapon. And there's been all sorts of radiological rhetoric recently, including the delivery of depleted uranium rounds for Challenger tanks, and the pledge of the U.S. government that they will be sending, or likely will be sending, depleted uranium rounds for the Abrams tanks when they finally get there later in the year. So we know that it seems like this is building up. This is a crescendo towards some sort of nuclear incident. Maybe it's just going to be the depleted uranium. Maybe it's going to be a dirty bomb. Maybe it's going to be an actual tactical nuke. Now, from the Russians' point of view, are they setting up the stage here for them themselves to do something like this and then blame it on the Ukrainians? Well, again, it's who do you want to believe at the end of the day? It's going to boil down to, because the fog of war is thick, and that's all there is to it. Transnistria is concerned over the increasing arms supplies to Moldova. So that is still a situation that is developing. Moldova is still arming up. They've given Ukraine a green light to come in there and offer them support in taking over Transnistria. And that's just another war front that is going to open up sooner than later. Mike Pence said that he believes that Russia will not stop at NATO borders in case of history. So this is the narrative, right? That Russia is not going to stop if they succeed in Ukraine. A lot of people chalk this up to be nonsense. Okay, maybe they will try to take the Baltic states, and maybe there's some truth that they are going to feel emboldened if the West does not resolutely act in order to prevent them from taking all over Ukraine. But even just to take Ukraine, Western Ukraine in particular, the amount of insurgents and asymmetrical guerrilla warfare that they would be tasked with managing for years to come would just make it not feasible. It just doesn't seem likely that they would, at least at this point in time, with so much ultra-nationalistic fervor present in Ukraine, it seems very unlikely that they would want to police that sort of situation. It would be a money pit, and they would get very little out of it. The juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze. Anyways, Mike Pence thinks that if Russia wins in Ukraine, the Russian army will cross the NATO border, thus forcing Americans to fight. So this is the mentality. This is the quagmire that we are in. If you're of the Western view, whether you're Mike Pence or otherwise, you believe that if Russia wins, it's going to be World War III. If you're of the Russian view, you believe that if they lose, it's going to be World War III. Either way, it's an inexorable march to World War III. Jens Stoltenberg says that if we're going to continue to support Ukraine, it's time to go full-blown war economy mode. So they're running out of weapons, so they say, and we got to start making more. Apparently, the Merkava tanks that were supposedly going to Ukraine, some people were speculating that these 200 tanks, this is unconfirmed, but BulgarianMilitary.com, who tends to be fairly accurate in their reporting, claims that it's not going to be Ukraine, but Cyprus and Morocco to replace the tanks that those two countries have given to Ukraine. So I guess we'll have to see. Cyprus is a very small country of only 1 million people. I don't see why they would need so many tanks. I do know they have some stuff they're trying to work out with Greece. Apparently, there are groups in Poland training for a coup in Belarus, according to the Times. And this is why not only is Belarus rumored to be getting tactical nukes, but also strategic ones. And according to a senior diplomat, those nukes will remain there indefinitely. What other videos do I have to show? Well, this is a video. I don't really want to show the whole thing. But this is a scene out of 1984. Very Orwellian. I'm not saying it's not entirely true because, yeah, there was Banderites in Ukraine, and there's a whole backstory there that people need to know about the history of Nazi Germany and Ukraine and how that whole thing went down. But it was very gruesome, some of the massacres and stuff that they talked about in this video that Putin showed at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And just the expression on people's faces. It was reminiscent of that, Hour of Hate. If you ever watched the movie 1984 with George Orwell or read the book, you know that there's like an hour of hate where they have to like scream and get mad at the screen. And this was right out of 1984. Again, not saying it's not true, but that is the sentiment in Russia, okay? This is just a fire that was raging in Moscow. Yet again, another fire. There's all kinds of fires all over Russia every single day. It's a country of 150 million people. Obviously, there's going to be fires, but of course, there's been an irregular amount of fires in places where there shouldn't be fires. In places like this, where it's a spectacle, right? Where it's thick black smoke that can be seen for miles and create fear in Russians. This was a video, and I don't know when this is from because there's so many videos like this going around. This looks like decoys of Russian S-300 or S-400 systems, and this is in the United States. We know that there were actual confiscated S-300 and S-400 systems in the United States seen before, but these are decoys. So you would jump to the conclusion then that the United States is preparing for war with the Russians, and I mean, they're already fighting a war. You have NATO intelligence, NATO funding, NATO mercenaries, the whole 9 yards fighting in Ukraine. We're effectively fighting the Russians. Anthony Blinken, I still don't know what to make of this guy. He seems like a guy who knows what he's doing is wrong, or knows what he's doing, he knows he's not telling the truth, but he struggles with it. And he's doing his best to kind of keep it together. And maybe one of these days he's just going to have to resign because he can't lie anymore. That's what I get with this guy. I get he's a guy who doesn't want to do what he's doing, but maybe he's having his arm twisted in a way. That's the vibe I get. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think of Anthony Blinken. Janet Yellen was asked a question the other day, and you guys can go and watch this video. She was basically asked about what would America do if they went to war with the Chinese and the Chinese liquidated all of their U.S. treasuries. Now, doing that would be a monumental task in and of itself. How feasible or likely that was to happen, I don't know. I know that China is in the process of de-dollarizing to the tune of several $billion every quarter, but to do it all at once, to dump that $859 billion in Treasury securities, is that even possible? But what would the outcome be? Obviously, this would lead to major economic turmoil. Yellen didn't seem to have any plan for this. And this is where you see the disconnect between national security and the Treasury, where I don't think the Treasury is, they must have some contingent or liaison with the military where they figure, okay, this is what's gonna, if we go to war with this country, then this is going to be the financial economic consequence. They must have somebody like that. But maybe they don't, and maybe they're just flying blind by the seat of their pants. It's possible. It's very possible. What else is going on in the world today? What else is going on in the world today? The Fear Extreme Greed Index. Let me just X out all this stuff here. According to CNN now, this is the CNN Extreme Fear, Extreme Greed Index. People are greedy right now. So this kind of maps on to the fear, uncertainty, and doubt indicator. For me, there's more fear, uncertainty, and doubt when this is at extreme greed, because that means a crash is coming. And if you didn't see my new shirt, to the moon, when they say to the moon, just remember there's no up and down in outer space. It's all relative. So yeah, to the moon can mean up or down. And when there's extreme greed in the markets, I'm very concerned that we're on the brink of the bubble popping. So I would not be surprised if that bubble started to deflate this week. It's always good to remember and remind people that right now the market is more overvalued than it was on Black Tuesday in 1929. I got to keep driving this point home. It's 30.78 right now. I believe it was around 30 on Black Tuesday, or 29 point something or other. And some people will say, well, yeah, but you got to look at the Shiller PE ratio post 2000 because it's different. Because there's more money in the system and there's more global stability. And I would make an argument that now, especially in light of what's happening between China and the United States and Russia, that there's more uncertainty and there is a move towards decoupling. There is more debt than ever before. There's $32 trillion in debt. The debt is higher than it's ever been before in terms of debt to GDP ratio. So there's no reason why we should be having a higher standard for the market being overvalued. The idea is that if there's more global economic stability, the market can be more overvalued because it's like an insurance policy. It's a sign that, you know, no matter what happens, that we have this stability around the world, and that's a foundation for the market prospering in the future. But I would say that the complete opposite is true, and that we very well will regress to the mean. And it's important to understand that while the average PE ratio is around 15, so we're twice the average, it can go as low as like what it did in 1920 when it was 5. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. Oh, this was the video with Zaluzny. Here's that video, guys. See if we can do full screen. I guess we can't do full screen. But anyways, if you go and you watch this video, it's just weird. People are blurred out. Some people aren't blurred out. he doesn't seem to be 100%. It seems very demonstrative. Doesn't seem very healthy. And he shows some other pictures of him there walking around. But what do I know? What do I know? You guys let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Once again, my friends, if you want to support the channel, go check out CanadianPreparedness.com. The best quality gear at the best possible prices. Use coupon code SurvivalPrepper for 10% off. Take care, guys. Canadian Prepper out.